The morning sun cast long shadows across the biggest ranch in Cedar Valley. Robert Harrison stood on his porch, coffee in hand, looking out at his empire. 10,000 acres of the finest land in all of Texas belonged to him. Cattle grazed peacefully in the distance, and his workers were already busy with their daily tasks. Robert was known throughout the county as a man who got what he wanted. He had built his fortune from nothing, and he never let anyone forget it. His laugh was loud, his handshake was firm, and his pride was bigger than his ranch. People respected him, but few truly liked him. He had a way of making others feel small, especially those who didn't have as much money as he did. Behind his grand mansion, hidden from the main road, stood a special paddock. It was built with the strongest steel fencing money could buy, reinforced with concrete posts that went deep into the ground. Inside this fortress lived Thunder, a magnificent black stallion that stood over 16 hands tall. His coat shone, like polished obsidian in the sunlight, and his muscles rippled with power beneath his sleek skin. Thunder was beautiful, but he was also dangerous. Very dangerous. 2 years ago, Robert had rescued the horse from a terrible situation. The previous owner had beaten Thunder regularly, keeping him locked in a tiny stall with barely enough food or water. When Robert found out about the abuse, he paid a fortune to buy the horse and bring him to his ranch. He thought his money and the best trainers in the state could fix any problem. He was wrong. Despite all the expensive training sessions and professional horse whisperers Robert hired, no one could get near Thunder. The stallion would rear up on his hind legs, strike out with his hooves, and charge at anyone who dared to enter his space. 3 trainers had been injured badly enough to need hospital visits. The insurance company had even threatened to drop Robert's coverage if he kept trying to train the horse. Now Thunder spent his days pacing back and forth in his paddock, a caged storm of muscle and fury. The ranch hands gave his area a wide berth, and visitors were warned to stay far away. Robert told people that Thunder was just a spirited horse who needed the right trainer, but deep down, he was starting to wonder if the animal was beyond help. On this particular morning, Robert was in an especially good mood. He had just closed a deal that would make him even richer, and several of his wealthy friends were coming over to celebrate. He loved showing off his ranch to people who had money, proving that he was just as successful as they were. Around noon, an old pickup truck came slowly up the long gravel driveway. The truck was at least 20 years old, with rust spots on the doors and a dent in the tailgate. It looked completely out of place among the expensive cars usually seen at the ranch. The truck stopped near the main house, and a teenage boy got out. He was maybe 16 years old, tall and thin, with work-calloused hands and sun-darkened skin. His clothes were clean but clearly second-hand, jeans with patches on the knees and a flannel shirt that had seen better days. His boots were worn, but well-maintained, the kind working people wore. The boy walked up to the porch where Robert was standing with his friends. He removed his baseball cap politely and looked Robert in the eye, but not in a challenging way. There was something humble about him, something that spoke of hardship faced with dignity. "Excuse me, sir," the boy said quietly. "My name is Danny Rodriguez. I heard you might have some work available. I'm willing to do anything. Clean stalls, mend fences, feed cattle, whatever you need." Robert's friends chuckled among themselves. Here was this poor kid asking for work, looking like he couldn't afford a decent meal. Robert saw an opportunity for entertainment. "Work, huh?" Robert said, setting down his coffee cup. "What makes you think you can handle ranch work, boy? This isn't some small-time operation, this is serious business." Danny nodded respectfully. "Yes, sir, I understand. I've been working with animals since I was little. My grandfather taught me a lot before he passed. I'm not afraid of hard work, and I learn fast." One of Robert's friends, a banker named William, leaned forward with interest. "What's the story, kid? Why do you need work so badly?" Danny hesitated for a moment, then spoke honestly. "My mother has been sick for months. The doctors say she needs surgery, but our insurance doesn't cover all of it. I'm trying to help pay for her medical bills." The men on the porch exchanged glances. Here was a touching sob story, but Robert wasn't feeling particularly charitable. Instead, He saw a chance to have some fun at the boy's expense. "Tell you what, Danny," Robert said, his voice taking on a mocking tone. "I've got a special challenge for you. See that black horse back there?" Robert pointed toward Thunder's paddock. Even from a distance, they could see the stallion moving restlessly, his powerful form cutting back and forth across his enclosure like a caged predator. "That's Thunder," Robert continued. "He's worth more than your truck, your house, and probably everything your family owns combined. The finest trainers in Texas have tried to work with him, and every single one has failed. Some ended up in the hospital." Danny looked toward the paddock, studying the distant figure of the horse. He didn't say anything, just watched and listened. Robert was warming up to his cruel game now. His friends were paying attention, and he always performed better with an audience. "Here's my offer," Robert announced loudly enough for all the ranch hands to hear. "If you can touch that horse, just lay one finger on him without getting trampled into the dirt, I'll give you this entire ranch. 10,000 acres, the house, the cattle, everything." The ranch workers stopped what they were doing to listen. Robert's friends leaned forward with interest. This was better than anything they could have planned for entertainment. "But," Robert continued with a wicked grin, "when you fail, and you will fail, boy, you'll work here for free for 6 months. No pay, just room and board. And you'll do the dirtiest, hardest jobs I can find." The crowd that had gathered started to murmur. Some laughed nervously, others shook their heads. Everyone knew Thunder's reputation. Asking this skinny teenager to touch the horse was like asking him to wrestle a tornado. William, the banker, spoke up. "Robert, don't you think that's a bit much?" "The kid just wants honest work." Robert waved him off. "Business is business, William. The boy came here asking for opportunity. I'm giving him the biggest opportunity of his life. He could become the richest teenager in Texas, or he could learn what happens when you bite off more than you can chew." All eyes turned to Danny. The smart thing would be to thank Robert politely and leave. Anyone with common sense would walk away from such an obviously rigged challenge. Thunder had injured professional trainers. What chance did a 16-year-old boy have? But Danny didn't walk away. Instead, he looked at Robert with those calm, steady eyes and nodded once. "I accept your challenge, sir." The crowd fell silent. Even Robert looked surprised. He had expected the boy to back down or maybe try to negotiate easier terms. Instead, Danny had agreed to face the most dangerous horse in the county. "You understand what you're agreeing to?" Robert asked, suddenly feeling like maybe he should give the kid one more chance to escape. "Yes, sir," Danny replied quietly. "I understand perfectly." Robert looked around at his friends and workers. He had made the challenge publicly, in front of witnesses. There was no backing down now without looking foolish. "Well then," Robert said, trying to recapture his confident tone, "I guess we have ourselves a deal. When do you want to try this impossible task?" Danny looked toward Thunder's paddock again, studying the horse with an intensity that made some people uncomfortable. There was something in his expression, not fear or recklessness, but a kind of quiet understanding. "If it's all right with you, sir," Danny said, "I'd like to start right now." The crowd followed Danny as he walked toward Thunder's paddock, their footsteps crunching on the gravel path. Some of the ranch workers were already placing bets on how long the boy would last before running away. The smart money was on less than 5 minutes. "Kid's got guts, I'll give him that," muttered one of the cowboys. "Guts won't help him when Thunder decides to turn him into pancake batter," replied another. Robert strutted alongside the group, feeling pleased with himself. This would be a story he could tell for years, about the poor kid who thought he could succeed where professional trainers had failed. He was already planning how he would describe Danny's inevitable retreat to his friends at the country club. When they reached the paddock, Thunder was in full display of his frightening power. The massive stallion was racing from one end of his enclosure to the other, his hooves pounding the earth like thunder. His black mane flew behind him like a war banner, and his eyes rolled wildly as he sensed the approaching crowd. Most people instinctively took a step back when they saw Thunder up close. The horse was even more intimidating in person than from a distance. His muscles bulged under his shining coat, and every movement radiated barely controlled violence. When he reared, up on his hind legs striking at the air with his front hooves, several spectators gasped and moved further away. But Danny didn't step back. Instead, he moved closer to the fence, studying Thunder with an intensity that surprised everyone watching. "Well, boy," Robert called out, his voice carrying a hint of mockery. "Having second thoughts? No one would blame you for admitting this. It's impossible." Danny didn't answer immediately. He was too busy observing the horse, watching every movement, every gesture, every sign that Thunder was giving him. The crowd grew impatient, expecting either action or surrender. Finally, Danny turned to Robert with a request that caught everyone off guard. "Sir, would it be possible for me to spend some time observing Thunder before I attempt to touch him?" Robert laughed out loud. "Observe him? Boy, what do you think you're going to see that million-dollar trainers haven't already figured out?" "I'd just like to understand him better," Danny replied calmly. "If that's acceptable to you." William the banker spoke up. "How much time are we talking about here, son?" Danny looked back at Thunder, who was still pacing frantically along the fence line. "Maybe the rest of today? I'd like to watch how he behaves when there aren't so many people around." This brought another round of laughter from the crowd. The idea that this teenager thought he could solve Thunder's problems by watching him seemed absurd to everyone present. "Fine," Robert said, waving his hand dismissively. "Watch him all you want. When you realize how hopeless this is, you can start your 6 months of free labor tomorrow morning." As the crowd began to disperse, Danny found a spot about 10 feet from Thunder's fence and simply sat down on the ground. He didn't try to get Thunder's attention or make any sudden movements. He just sat there, quietly watching. Thunder noticed the boy immediately, the horse's ears pinned back against his head, a clear sign of aggression and distrust. He snorted loudly and pawed the ground, trying to intimidate this new human who dared to stay so close to his territory. But Danny didn't react to Thunder's threatening behavior. He didn't jump up or move away. He didn't even look directly at the horse, which seemed to confuse Thunder. Most humans either ran away from his displays of aggression or tried to stare him down. This boy was doing neither. As the afternoon wore on, some of the ranch workers found excuses to walk past Thunder's paddock. They were curious about what Danny thought he was accomplishing by just sitting there. To their surprise, the boy never moved from his spot. He sat perfectly still, occasionally shifting position but never leaving his post. "What's he doing out there?" asked Carlos, one of the senior ranch hands. "Beats me," replied his partner Tom. "Been sitting there for 3 hours now, just watching that crazy horse pace around." What the ranch hands couldn't see from their distance was the subtle change that was beginning to occur. Danny had grown up helping his grandfather, an old cowboy named Miguel who had spent 60 years working with horses. Miguel had taught Danny that horses were like mirrors. They reflected the emotions and energy of the people around them. As Danny watched Thunder, he began to see things that others had missed. The way Thunder's ears would flick forward for just a moment when a bird sang nearby before pinning back again. The way the horse would slow his pacing when the ranch got quieter, only to speed up again when he heard loud voices or sudden noises. Most telling of all was what Danny saw in Thunder's eyes. Where others saw wildness and aggression, Danny recognized something else entirely. Fear. Deep, bone-deep terror that had been burned into the horse's soul by months of abuse and mistreatment. "You're not mean," Danny whispered quietly, so softly that Thunder couldn't hear him. "You're scared." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, something remarkable happened. Thunder's frantic pacing began to slow. The horse was still moving back and forth along the fence, but his movements were becoming less desperate, less panicked. Danny noticed that Thunder was starting to steal glances at him. Quick looks at first, as if the horse was trying to figure out what this strange human was doing. When Danny didn't react to these glances, didn't try to make eye contact or reach out, Thunder began to look more often. By the time the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Thunder had stopped pacing altogether. The big stallion stood near the center of his paddock, no longer showing the constant agitation that had marked his behavior for the past 2 years. When Danny finally stood up to leave, moving slowly and carefully so as not to startle Thunder, he spoke to the horse, for the first time. "I'll see you tomorrow, big guy," he said in a voice barely above a whisper. "We're going to figure this out together." To the amazement of anyone who might have been watching, Thunder lifted his head and made a soft, whinnying sound. It was quiet and gentle, nothing like the angry screams and snorts the horse usually made. Robert, who had been watching from his office window, nearly dropped his glass of whiskey. In 2 years of owning Thunder, he had never heard the horse make such a peaceful sound. As Danny walked back toward his old pickup truck, he passed several ranch workers who were finishing up their evening chores. They looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and respect. Word was already spreading that something unusual had happened at Thunder's paddock. "How'd it go, kid?" asked Carlos, the senior ranch hand. Danny paused for a moment, considering his answer. "I think Thunder and I are starting to understand each other." Carlos looked toward the paddock, where Thunder was now standing calmly near the fence, no longer pacing or showing signs of distress. "Well, I'll be damned," Carlos muttered. "In all my years working here, I've never seen that horse stand still for more than a few seconds." As Danny drove away in his old truck, he was already planning his approach for the next day. He knew that gaining Thunder's trust would take time and patience, 2 things that couldn't be bought with money or forced through dominance. Back at the main house, Robert sat in his study, staring out at Thunder's paddock. The horse was still standing peacefully, looking almost normal for the first time since arriving at the ranch. For the first time since making his cocky bet, Robert began to wonder if he might have underestimated the quiet teenager with the old truck and the humble manner. The thought made him deeply uncomfortable, but he couldn't shake the feeling that tomorrow might bring some very big surprises. Danny arrived at the ranch before sunrise the next morning. The sky was still painted in soft shades of purple and pink, and the morning air carried the sweet smell of hay and the distant sound of cattle stirring in their pastures. Most of the ranch workers wouldn't start their day for another hour, which was exactly what Danny had hoped for. He parked his truck in the same spot as the day before and walked quietly toward Thunder's paddock. The horse was standing near the far fence, his head turned toward the approaching footsteps. When Thunder saw Danny, his ears pricked forward slightly before settling into a neutral position, not pinned back in aggression, but not fully forward in welcome either. Danny took this as a good sign. Yesterday, Thunder's ears had been flat against his head the entire time, a clear signal of hostility and fear. Today, the horse seemed more curious than threatened. Danny settled into the same spot where he had spent the previous afternoon sitting, cross-legged on the ground about 10 feet from the fence. He didn't look directly at Thunder, instead gazing out across the ranch while keeping the horse in his peripheral vision. Thunder began to pace again, but it was different from the frantic movement of yesterday. His steps were more deliberate, less panicked. It was as if the horse was testing this strange human, trying to figure out what Danny wanted from him. As the morning progressed, ranch workers began arriving for their daily tasks. Some of them walked past Thunder's paddock on their way to other parts of the ranch, and Danny noticed how Thunder's behavior changed when they appeared. The horse would tense up, his movements becoming more agitated, his breathing becoming heavier. But when the workers passed by and the area grew quiet again, Thunder would gradually calm down. It was clear that the horse associated most humans with stress and danger, but he was beginning to make an exception for the quiet boy who just sat peacefully nearby. Around mid-morning, Robert appeared with his morning coffee, walking over to check on his unusual visitor. Several ranch hands followed, curious to see what was happening with the impossible bet their boss had made. "Still planning to touch that killer horse, boy?" Robert called out, his voice carrying across the paddock. The sound of Robert's loud voice had an immediate effect on Thunder. The horse's head shot up, his eyes rolled, and he began the rapid pacing that everyone was familiar with. Within seconds, Thunder had transformed from a merely cautious animal back into the frightening creature that had terrorized so many trainers. Danny watched this transformation with great interest. It confirmed what he had begun to suspect. Thunder's aggressive behavior was closely linked to certain types of human behavior. Loud voices, sudden movements, and aggressive postures all triggered the horse's defensive responses. "I'm still working on it, sir," Danny replied quietly, not raising his voice or making any sudden movements. Robert was about to make another sarcastic comment when something stopped him. As soon as Danny spoke in his calm, quiet voice, Thunder's behavior began to change again. The horse's ears moved forward slightly and his pacing slowed. It was as if the horse could distinguish between different types of human voices and responded accordingly. "Well, I'll be," muttered Tom, one of the ranch hands. "Look at that horse paying attention to the kid." Robert felt a strange mixture of emotions. Part of him was impressed by what he was seeing, but another part was uncomfortable with the idea that this poor teenager might actually succeed where expensive professionals had failed. It would be embarrassing to lose his ranch to a 16-year-old boy, even though he had made the bet publicly. After Robert and his followers moved on, Danny settled back into his patient observation. He had brought a water bottle and a simple lunch, planning to spend the entire day near Thunder's paddock if necessary. As the hours passed, something beautiful began to happen. Thunder started spending more time near the fence where Danny sat. At first, the horse would venture close for just a few moments before retreating to the far side of his enclosure. But gradually, these visits became longer and more frequent. Danny noticed that Thunder seemed particularly responsive to soft sounds. When a gentle breeze rustled the leaves in nearby trees, or when birds sang in the distance, Thunder would lift his head and listen with obvious pleasure. This gave Danny an idea. Remembering the old songs his grandfather Miguel used to hum while working with horses, Danny began to softly hum one of the melodies. It was a simple tune, something Miguel had learned from his own father many years ago. The words were in Spanish, but Danny just hummed the melody, letting the gentle sound drift across the paddock. Thunder's reaction was immediate and dramatic. The horse stopped moving entirely and turned his full attention toward Danny. His ears were fully forward now, and his eyes were soft and curious rather than wild and fearful. Encouraged by this response, Danny continued humming. He kept his voice low and soothing, the way his grandfather had taught him. Miguel had always said that horses could hear the emotions in a person's voice, and that a calm, gentle tone could soothe even the most troubled animal. For the next several hours, Danny alternated between sitting in peaceful silence and humming the old songs Miguel had taught him. Thunder moved closer and closer to the fence until he was standing just a few feet away from where Danny sat. The change in Thunder's appearance was remarkable. Gone was the wild-eyed, aggressive stallion that had terrorized the ranch for 2 years. In his place stood a magnificent but gentle horse, curious about the young human who sat so peacefully nearby. Word of what was happening spread throughout the ranch. Workers found excuses to walk past Thunder's paddock, amazed by what they were seeing. Some of them had been working with horses for decades, but they had never witnessed such a dramatic transformation in an animal's behavior. Carlos, the senior ranch hand, stopped by during his lunch break. He stood at a respectful distance, not wanting to disturb the delicate progress that was being made. "I've been working with horses for 30 years, he told his companion quietly. "Never seen anything like this. That boy's got a gift." As the afternoon wore on, Thunder began to show signs of genuine curiosity about Danny. The horse would stretch his neck toward the fence, as if trying to catch Danny's scent. His nostrils would flare gently as he investigated this strange human, who didn't demand anything from him, didn't try to control him, and didn't pose any threat. Danny was careful not to rush the process. Every time Thunder showed interest, Danny remained perfectly still, allowing the horse to investigate at his own pace. When Thunder backed away, Danny didn't try to follow or encourage him to return. He simply waited patiently for Thunder to feel comfortable enough to approach again. As the sun began to set on his second day at the ranch, Danny knew that he and Thunder had made incredible progress. The horse was now spending most of his time near the fence where Danny sat, and his entire demeanor had changed from fearful and aggressive to curious and calm. When Danny finally stood up to leave, Thunder actually followed him along the fence line, walking parallel to the boy as he moved toward the gate. It was as if the horse didn't want their time together to end. "See you tomorrow, Thunder," Danny said softly, using the horse's name for the first time. Thunder responded with another gentle whinny, the same peaceful sound he had made the night before. But this time, several ranch hands were close enough to hear it, and word quickly spread to Robert that something extraordinary was happening at Thunder's paddock. That evening, Robert stood at his office window, watching Thunder in the fading light. The horse was standing calmly near the fence, no longer pacing or showing any signs of the agitation that had marked his behavior for the past 2 years. For the first time since making his arrogant bet, Robert began to seriously consider the possibility that he might actually lose his ranch to a humble teenager with an old pickup truck. The thought terrified him more than he cared to admit. The third morning arrived with an electric feeling in the air. Word had spread far beyond the ranch about the impossible bet between Robert Harrison and the teenager who thought he could touch the untouchable horse. Local news reporters had gotten wind of the story, and several television crews were setting up their equipment near Thunder's paddock. Danny felt nervous as he drove up the long gravel driveway and saw all the vehicles and people gathered around the ranch. This was supposed to be between him and Thunder, but now it felt like the whole world was watching. He parked his old truck and took a deep breath, trying to calm the butterflies in his stomach. Thunder was already waiting at the fence when Danny approached. The magnificent stallion had his head raised, looking toward the growing crowd with obvious anxiety. His ears were flicking back and forth, and Danny could see the tension building in the horse's powerful body. "Easy, big guy," Danny whispered as he took his usual spot on the ground. "I know there are a lot of people here, but we're going to take this slow, just like always." Robert appeared shortly after Danny, followed by a group that had grown significantly since yesterday. In addition to his wealthy friends and ranch workers, there were now newspaper reporters, television cameras, and curious neighbors who had driven over to witness what many people were calling the impossible challenge. "Well, boy," Robert announced, loudly, clearly enjoying the attention from the media, "today's the day. Are you ready to admit this was all a foolish dream, or are you actually going to try to touch that killer horse?" The crowd murmured with anticipation. Most of the people present expected to see either a quick surrender from Danny or a dramatic scene of the boy running for his life when Thunder showed his true violent nature. But something had changed over the past 2 days, something that Robert and his friends couldn't see from their distance. Thunder was no longer the same terrified, aggressive animal that had arrived at the ranch 2 years ago. The patient, gentle presence of the quiet teenager had awakened something in the horse that everyone had thought was lost forever. Danny stood up slowly and walked toward Thunder's gate. The crowd fell silent, watching every step. Camera operators zoomed in, reporters held their breath, and even the ranch workers stopped what they were doing to witness what was about to happen. Thunder watched Danny approach with eyes that were alert but not fearful. The horse's ears were forward, and his body language showed curiosity rather than aggression. To the amazement of everyone watching, Thunder actually moved toward the gate, as Danny approached, as if he was eager to be closer to his young friend. "Incredible," whispered one of the television reporters into her microphone. "The horse is actually approaching the boy voluntarily." Danny reached the gate and paused, his hand resting on the latch. This was the moment that would determine everything. Not just whether he won Robert's challenge, but whether the trust he had built with Thunder over the past 2 days was real and strong enough to overcome the horse's traumatic past. "You ready for this, Thunder?" Danny asked quietly, his voice carrying only to the horse's sensitive ears. Thunder stretched his neck toward the gate, his nostrils flaring as he took in Danny's familiar scent. The horse made a soft sound, almost like a gentle greeting, that caused several people in the crowd to gasp in surprise. Robert felt his confidence wavering for the first time since making the bet. From his position 30 feet away, he could see that something fundamental had changed in Thunder's behavior. The horse, that had terrorized every trainer who tried to work with him, was now acting like a completely different animal. Danny opened the gate slowly, the hinges creaking softly in the morning air. Thunder didn't back away or show any signs of alarm. Instead, the horse took a step closer, bringing his massive head near enough that Danny could feel the warmth of Thunder's breath on his face. The crowd was completely silent now, Even the reporters had stopped their commentary, too amazed by what they were witnessing to find words. Here was a teenage boy, standing inches away from a horse that had put 3 professional trainers in the hospital, and the animal was showing no signs of aggression whatsoever. Danny began to hum one of the soft melodies his grandfather had taught him, the same songs that had helped calm Thunder over the past 2 days. The familiar sound seemed to relax the horse even further, and Thunder's eyes grew soft and trusting. Slowly, carefully, Danny raised his hand. His movements were deliberate and calm, telegraphing his intentions so that Thunder would never feel surprised or threatened. The horse watched every movement with interest, but without fear. "Easy, boy," Danny whispered. "We've come so far together. Just a little bit more." Thunder's ears remained forward, his breathing steady and calm. When Danny's hand was just inches away from Thunder's neck, the horse actually leaned forward slightly, as if inviting the touch that everyone had said was impossible. The moment Danny's fingers made contact with Thunder's neck, the crowd erupted in gasps and exclamations of disbelief. Several people started clapping, and the television reporters began speaking rapidly into their microphones. But Danny barely heard any of it. His entire focus was on Thunder, on the warm, living connection between them. The horse's coat was softer than silk under his fingers, and he could feel the powerful muscles relaxing under his gentle touch. Thunder closed his eyes and leaned into Danny's hand, making a sound of pure contentment that no one at the ranch had ever heard before. It was a sound of trust, of peace, of a damaged soul finally finding comfort and safety. For several long minutes, Danny simply stood there stroking Thunder's neck while the horse enjoyed the gentle attention. The crowd watched in amazed silence, many of them wiping tears from their eyes as they witnessed this beautiful moment of connection between a boy and a horse that everyone had given up for lost. Robert Harrison stood frozen in place, his mouth hanging open in shock. The arrogant confidence he had felt just minutes earlier had completely evaporated. This humble teenager, this boy he had thought to humiliate and exploit, had accomplished something that Robert's money and pride never could. When Danny finally stepped back from Thunder, the horse followed him to the gate, clearly reluctant to see their interaction end. Danny scratched Thunder's forehead gently, then stepped out of the paddock and secured the gate behind him. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. People rushed forward to congratulate Danny. Reporters thrust microphones in his face and cameras flashed from every direction. But through it all, Danny kept looking back at Thunder, who was watching the celebration with calm, intelligent eyes. "How did you do it?" shouted one reporter over the noise of the crowd. "What's your secret?" called another. Danny looked around at all the excited faces, then back at Thunder standing peacefully in his paddock. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but clear enough for everyone to hear. "There was no secret," he said simply. "Thunder isn't a mean horse, he never was. He was just scared and hurt, and he needed someone to show him that not all people are dangerous. Sometimes the answer isn't about being stronger or having more money. Sometimes it's just about being patient and kind." As the crowd continued to celebrate around him, Danny noticed that Robert had not joined in the congratulations. The ranch owner stood apart from the group, his face pale and his hands shaking slightly. Danny walked over to Robert, moving away from the reporters and cameras. When he spoke, his voice was respectful but firm. "Mr. Harrison," he said quietly, "I believe you have something that belongs to me now." The celebration around Thunder's paddock gradually quieted as people noticed the tense conversation happening between Danny and Robert. Television cameras turned toward them, and reporters strained to hear what was being said between the teenager, who had just accomplished the impossible, and the wealthy rancher who now faced losing everything. Robert's face had gone through several shades of color, from his usual confident tan to pale white, then to an uncomfortable red. His hands were trembling slightly as he stared at Danny, then at Thunder, then back at Danny again. The reality of what had just happened was slowly sinking in. He had made a public bet, in front of witnesses, with television cameras rolling. A legal handshake deal that he could never deny or escape. This humble 16-year-old boy now owned his ranch, his house, his cattle, and everything he had spent his entire life building. The bet was clear, Danny said quietly, his voice steady but not unkind. You said if I could touch Thunder, you would give me your ranch. Everyone here heard you say it. The crowd pressed closer, sensing that this was the most important moment of the entire story. Some people were recording on their phones, others were taking pictures, and the news reporters were capturing every word. Robert opened his mouth several times, trying to find words that wouldn't come. His wealthy friends stood nearby watching, their once confident companion struggle with a situation that money and influence couldn't fix. For the first time in his life, Robert Harrison was completely powerless. Robert started, then stopped. He looked around at all the faces watching, him then back at Danny's calm, patient expression. The boy wasn't gloating or demanding. He was simply stating a fact. Carlos, the senior ranch hand, stepped forward from the crowd. Mr. Harrison, he said respectfully, the boy's right. We all heard you make that bet, shake on it and everything. Other ranch workers nodded in agreement. They had watched their boss make the impossible wager, laughing and certain that he would never have to pay up. Now they waited to see what kind of man Robert really was when the stakes were real. Robert felt a strange sensation in his chest, something he hadn't experienced in many years. It took him a moment to recognize it as shame, not shame about losing the bet, but shame about why he had made it in the first place. He had tried to humiliate a poor kid who was just trying to help his sick mother. He had used his wealth and power to set up what he thought would be public entertainment at Danny's expense. And somehow, this humble teenager had turned the tables completely. You're right, Robert said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. A deal is a deal. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his cell phone, his hand still shaking slightly. I'll call my lawyer right now. Have him draw up the papers to transfer everything to you. Danny watched Robert dial the number, but then did something that surprised everyone present. He reached out and gently placed his hand on Robert's phone, stopping him from making the call. Wait, Danny said softly. Robert looked up, confused. What do you mean, wait? You won fair and square. The ranch is yours. Danny glanced back at Thunder, who was still watching the proceedings with calm interest. Then he looked around at the ranch workers, many of whom were staring at him with expressions of respect and amazement. Mr. Harrison, Danny said carefully, can I ask you something? Robert nodded, not trusting his voice. Why did you rescue Thunder in the first place? The question caught Robert off guard. He had expected demands about paperwork or moving dates, not a question about his motivations from 2 years ago. When I heard what that previous owner was doing to him, beating him and keeping him locked up, Robert's voice trailed off, as he remembered. It made me angry. No animal deserves that kind of treatment. So you spent a lot of money to save him, Danny continued, even though you didn't know if he could ever be helped. Yes, but what does that have to do with anything? Danny looked around at the beautiful ranch, at the well-maintained buildings and healthy cattle grazing in the distance. You built all this from nothing, didn't you? Your workers respect you even if they don't always like your attitude, and despite everything that happened here today, you were willing to honor your bet instead of trying to find a way out of it. Robert didn't know where Danny was going with this, but he nodded slowly. Mr. Harrison, Danny said, his voice growing stronger, I don't want your ranch. The crowd gasped and several reporters started talking at once. Even Thunder seemed to prick his ears forward, as if he was listening to this unexpected development. What? Robert stammered. But the bet, you won. I did win, Danny agreed. And because I won, the ranch belongs to me now, which means I can do whatever I want with it. Danny paused, looking around at all the shocked faces surrounding them. What I want to do is give it back to you. The silence that followed was so complete that they could hear birds singing in the trees and cattle lowing in the distant pastures. Robert stared at Danny as if the boy had suddenly started speaking a foreign language. But why? Robert asked, his voice cracking with emotion. Danny smiled, the first time anyone had seen him truly smile since arriving at the ranch 3 days ago. Because I didn't come here to take your ranch, Mr. Harrison. I came here looking for work to help pay for my mother's medical bills. and because I think Thunder taught us both something important over the past few days. What did he teach us? Robert asked quietly. That sometimes the people who seem the most dangerous or difficult are really just scared and hurt. Thunder wasn't a mean horse. He was a traumatized horse who needed patience and understanding. And I think maybe... Danny paused, choosing his words carefully. Maybe sometimes people are the same way. Robert felt tears stinging his eyes, something that hadn't happened since he was a child. This boy, this humble teenager he had tried to humiliate, was offering him grace he didn't deserve. "You're saying I was scared and hurt?" Robert asked. "I'm saying that people who have everything sometimes act like they have nothing to lose," Danny replied gently. "And people who have been hurt sometimes hurt others without meaning to." The crowd watched in amazement as Robert Harrison, one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in the county, began to cry. Not from sadness, but from a mixture of relief, gratitude, and something that felt like hope. "I don't understand," Robert said through his tears. "What do you want from me?" Danny thought for a moment, then looked back at Thunder standing peacefully in his paddock. "I want a job," he said simply. "A real job, with fair pay so I can help my mother get the medical care she needs. And I want to work with Thunder and maybe other horses that need help. I think we make a good team." Robert wiped his eyes and looked at this remarkable young man who had just given him back his entire life. "Danny," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I'll do better than give you a job. I want to make you my partner. You'll help me run this ranch and we'll turn it into a place where damaged horses can heal, just like Thunder did." Danny's eyes widened. "Are you serious?" "Dead serious," Robert replied, extending his hand for a shake. "Partners?" As Danny reached out to shake Robert's hand, Thunder let out a loud, joyful whinny that seemed to echo across the entire ranch. The crowd erupted in cheers even louder than before, and several people were crying openly as they witnessed this unexpected ending to what had started as a cruel bet. The story of Danny and Thunder spread far beyond Cedar Valley, becoming a legend about the power of patience, kindness, and second chances. The ranch became exactly what Robert had promised: a sanctuary for traumatized horses and a place where both animals and people could learn to trust again. And Thunder, the horse everyone said could never be helped, became the living symbol of what was possible when someone chose understanding over force, patience over pride, and compassion over cruelty. Years later, when people asked Danny about the secret to his success with difficult horses, he would always give the same answer his grandfather Miguel had taught him. "There are no problem horses, only horses with problems, and every problem can be solved with enough patience and love."